A park ranger is flying a helicopter low over one of the most remote stretches of Death Valley, looking for something completely unrelated: illegal drug labs hidden out in the backcountry. It's October of 1996, and from the air, something catches his eye that doesn't belong out here at all, in a landscape of nothing but dry rock and endless heat shimmer. A green minivan, sitting alone in a dry wash, miles from any real road, on a stretch of desert so isolated that most park visitors would never even know it existed, let alone find themselves stranded here. He lands. He walks up to it. 3 of the 4 tires are shredded down to the rims. The van has clearly been driven for miles on nothing but torn rubber and bare metal before it finally gave up and sank into the sand. Inside, he finds sleeping bags, empty water containers, undeveloped rolls of film, a Death Valley park guide, its pages likely studied and restudied by someone trying to figure out a way home, and an American flag that, it will later turn out, was taken from a stone cabin 5 miles away. What he doesn't find is anyone. No bodies, no footprints leading away, the desert wind having erased those within days. No sign of which direction 4 human beings might have gone after they climbed out of this van and walked into one of the hottest, most lethal landscapes on the entire planet. This van had been sitting here for 3 months, and somewhere out in that desert, a family from Germany had been missing the entire time. Welcome back to the Ink Vault. To understand how this family ended up on a road that wasn't even legal to drive on, you have to understand who they were and why they were here in the first place. Egbert Rimkus was 34 years old, an architect from Dresden, Germany, who'd just come out of a difficult divorce. His girlfriend, Cornelia, everyone called her Connie, was 27. She had a young son, Max, just 4 years old, from a previous relationship. Egbert had his own son, Georg, a young schoolboy, several years older than Max. This wasn't just a vacation. It was a new blended family taking their first real trip together, 3 weeks touring the American West, California, Nevada, the kind of open-road adventure that looks incredible on a map back home in Germany, the kind of trip you plan when you're trying to build something new out of the pieces of an old life. For Egbert, specifically, this trip carried a little more weight than an ordinary vacation. He'd recently come out of that divorce. This new relationship was still finding its footing. And now 2 boys from 2 different families were being asked to bond with each other over 3 weeks in a rented minivan. They were still figuring out together what this new family was actually going to look like. They landed in Seattle on July 8, 1996, connected through to Los Angeles, and rented a green Plymouth Voyager minivan. From there, the trip went exactly the way you'd hope. They soaked up the sun in San Clemente. They hit the Las Vegas Strip, stayed in one of the big casino hotels, even won a little money at the slot machines. Every piece of evidence from those first 2 weeks points to a family genuinely enjoying themselves, genuinely becoming closer. Their flight home out of Los Angeles was booked for July 27th, and at some point after Vegas, before that flight, they decided to spend a few days doing something a lot of tourists never think to do: driving deep into the backcountry of Death Valley National Park, off the paved roads, into the kind of terrain most rental car companies explicitly tell you not to take their vehicles. Here's what investigators pieced together years later, using tire tracks, mileage, and the physical evidence left behind in that van. The family drove out toward a remote area near Mengel Pass, following old mining roads deep into the park's backcountry. At some point, the terrain became too rough even for a determined driver, and they turned around, likely intending to head back the way they'd come toward the main highway. But somewhere in that decision, they looked at their map and saw what appeared to be a shortcut, a route back to the valley floor through a place called Anvil Spring Canyon, past a landmark called Willow Spring. On paper, it looked like the faster way home. What they didn't know, what most visitors to the park wouldn't have known, was that this particular route had been officially closed to vehicles 2 years earlier. It wasn't maintained. It wasn't signed as a through route. It was barely a road at all anymore, more of a suggestion of where a road used to be, slowly being reclaimed by loose sand and scattered rock. They took it anyway. As the terrain grew sandier, Egbert likely did what a lot of drivers instinctively do when they feel their vehicle starting to bog down. He gave it more gas, trying to power through before the tires lost traction completely. At some point, moving at speed across ground littered with sharp rock, the van struck something hard enough to blow a tire, then another, then a third. Investigators later determined the family kept driving anyway, for roughly 2 more miles, on nothing but shredded rubber and bare metal rims, before the van finally sank into soft sand up to its axle and simply would not move again. A family of 4, 2 of them small children, stopped dead in one of the most remote, hottest places in North America, with a vehicle that was never moving again under its own power. The evidence in the van tells us they didn't panic immediately. They spent at least 1 night there. Investigators found signs of a camp, food packaging, evidence they'd dug a latrine nearby. This wasn't a family that lost their heads the second things went wrong. They tried to think it through, and the next morning, they made a choice that would decide everything. They gathered what they could carry, left the van behind, and started walking. Looking at their map, they had real options. Due east sat the main highway through the park, roughly 17 miles away. A long walk, but a realistic one if they'd had enough water and started early. Instead, the evidence suggests they walked south, down through a canyon toward an area called Wingate Wash, toward the China Lake Naval Weapons Station boundary. The most likely reason, a military installation meant people who could help, and it looked closer than a distant highway they weren't even certain they could reach on foot. It was a reasonable guess made by exhausted, frightened people trying to save their children. It also turned out to be catastrophically wrong. That boundary marked on the map wasn't a manned gate with people standing by. It was just a line on paper, out in the middle of nothing, with no fence, no building, no person within miles of it. The temperature that week in Death Valley exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Some records for the area that summer pushed past 115. Imagine walking that terrain, cracked earth, radiating heat back up at you, no shade for miles, carrying a 4-year-old whose legs had already given out, while genuinely believing that help was just over the next ridge. When the ranger found that van in October and investigators confirmed it belonged to the missing German family, Inyo County launched a serious search operation. 45 searchers, 8 horses, 4 helicopters combing the surrounding terrain from California and Nevada law enforcement agencies. They found 1 beer bottle, roughly a quarter mile from the van, matching a package left behind inside it. That was it. No bodies, no clothing, no confirmed footprints. The desert had already had 3 months to erase every trace of 4 people walking through it, and the search area officials focused on, based on where they assumed a family would logically try to walk, simply wasn't where the family had actually gone. After days of searching turned up nothing further, the operation was called off. The case went cold. For over a decade, the Death Valley Germans became one of those unsettling stories that circulated among park rangers and true crime enthusiasts, a family that had seemingly walked into the desert and dissolved into it completely. In 2009, 13 years after the family vanished, a search and rescue volunteer named Tom Mahood started digging back through the old Inyo County Sheriff's case files. He'd been fascinated by this case since it first made headlines back in 1996, enough that it was part of what pushed him to train for search and rescue work in the first place. Everyone else had searched where they expected the family to go. Mahood decided to search where they might actually have gone. He noticed the official 1996 investigation had all but written off that southern route toward the naval boundary as illogical and had never thoroughly searched it. Working with local searchers who'd made informal attempts over the years, he built a theory based on the terrain, the map the family would have carried, and simple human psychology under extreme stress, and set out to test it himself. He spent months searching that specific stretch of desert. In the fall of 2009, Mahood and a search partner found human remains scattered across an isolated stretch of desert, miles southeast of where the van had been discovered. Near a bluff, alongside an old travel guide, and the same kind of empty beer bottles found near the van years earlier, bottles the family had likely kept and refilled with whatever water they could find, using anything they had as makeshift canteens. The remains were eventually identified as Egbert Rimkus and Cornelia Meyer. Additional bone fragments, likely belonging to the two boys, were also recovered. Not all 4 family members could be fully individually confirmed, a small mercy, in a way, for a family who never got confirmation of anything else. Egbert's remains were found on higher ground compared to the others, consistent, investigators believe, with a final desperate climb to try to spot a road, a light, anything in the distance. He had walked roughly 5 miles from that abandoned van, through triple-digit heat, likely trying to carry an exhausted 4-year-old for at least part of that distance, before the desert finally took him too. 13 years after they vanished, the Death Valley Germans were found. Not because of new technology, not because of a confession, but because one man refused to accept that we already searched there and found nothing meant the search was actually finished. Here's what genuinely unsettles me about this case. Every decision this family made, in isolation, was reasonable. Taking a scenic backcountry detour on a family trip? Reasonable. Trusting a shortcut marked on an official park map? Reasonable. Believing a military installation marked on that same map would have people who could help you? Completely reasonable. There was no single moment of obvious, foolish recklessness here. Just a chain of ordinary, understandable choices made by people trying to protect their children that happened to lead directly into one of the least survivable environments in North America. The van sat there for 3 months before anyone even knew where to start looking. And even then, it took 13 years and one stubborn volunteer who wouldn't accept "we already checked" as a final answer, before this family finally stopped being a mystery and started being a story with an actual ending. So here's what I want to know from you. If you were stranded out there with your kids, no working vehicle, water running low, and you had to pick a direction, the known highway 17 miles away, or a closer military boundary marked on a map that you had no way of confirming was actually manned, which one would you have gambled on? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. Follow the Ink Vault. We go where others don't.